welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are engaging with a concept that forms the very bedrock of organized political life: constitutionalism.
It's a structure so foundational that most of us really take it for granted.
We do. We treat it like the background noise of government, until, of course, that structure faces some kind of existential challenge.
Right? And then we suddenly realize how important it is.
Our mission today is to go beyond those surface-level definitions and really unpack the philosophical architecture of power itself. We're drawing solely from a rigorous and, I have to say, a deeply illuminating essay centered on the ideas of Mortimer Adler.
And this isn't just a history lesson.
No, not at all. It's more like an autopsy of legitimacy.
And that emphasis on the philosophical architecture is so vital for anyone listening. We aren't just summarizing what a constitution is. We're pursuing an understanding of why it must be what it is. This deep dive will offer a precise definition, trace its surprisingly ancient origins in political thought, and, this is the crucial part, explore the profound philosophical stakes inherent in constitutional design according to Adler's framework.
And before we proceed, we should probably mention the unique way we're able to move through this material.
Yes. The conversational dynamic you are experiencing allows us to synthesize this dense material very, very rapidly.
That is right. You're experiencing a unique two-host AI conversation powered by Google's Notebook LM for deeper, more dynamic essay analysis.
It really lets us process these complex philosophical ideas quickly.
It does. It ensures we extract the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight from this essay for you.
Indeed. Our goal here is absolute understanding, moving way past mere information transfer. The essay proposes that a constitution provides the essential scaffolding for any political system that claims to be just.
And by the end of this discussion, you should be able to articulate the fundamental problem a constitution is designed to solve.
And most importantly, how we can philosophically test its adequacy against these universal claims of justice.
Okay, let's unpack this core immediately. If we strip away all the legislative detail, all the amendments, what is the functional core definition of a constitution, according to this essay?
What did Adler pinpoint as the non-negotiable elements?
Exactly.
Adler's framework insists on real precision here. At its very core, he defines a constitution as the fundamental framework that defines three interlocking characteristics of political power.
Okay, what are they?
How it is organized, how it is limited, and how it is ultimately made accountable.
Organized, limited, and accountable.
That's the triad. And this applies to a body of citizens who are themselves understood to be fundamentally free and equal, or at least striving toward that ideal.
That triad, it seems like the necessary prerequisite for moving a regime beyond just arbitrary temporary rule.
It is. It's the moment that structure imposes an enduring restraint on raw political force.
So we have to go deeper into each element. What does it actually mean for the structure to be organized?
To be organized means establishing the official roles and responsibilities, the public offices that are necessary for governing.
So defining the players on the board.
Exactly. This framework specifies what those roles are, what their specific powers entail, and crucially, the exact rules and procedures they have to follow for making and applying all other subsidiary laws.
So the highest level of system design.
It is. Without this constitutional organization, you can't even define legitimate action within a state. Every decision would be ad hoc and potentially challengeable by rival factions.
So the Constitution doesn't govern in the everyday sense.
No.
It defines who gets to govern and how. And that definition, that organization, that must lead directly to the concept of supreme law.
It does.
What makes a constitution functionally superior to, say, a budget bill or an environmental regulation that the legislature passes?
The essay defines it as the first and fundamental law. This elevates its status far, far above ordinary legislation.
Because it's the source code.
It is the source code. Because the Constitution is the originating source of authority, it literally creates the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. It logically has to stand above the laws these branches produce.
So it's the primary constraint.
It is. It sets the limits on all delegated authority.
That hierarchical positioning is the key differentiator, isn't it? If a legislature passes a statute, and that statute conflicts with the constitutional text, the statute has to yield.
It has to. This implies a non-delegable authority.
So what enforces that?
Well, the essay is clear. Ordinary laws, statutes, administrative rulings, they must conform entirely to the Constitution. If they do not, they are illegitimate. They are null and void.
And the mechanism for that?
The mechanism is judicial review. This is the crucial practical manifestation of the Constitution's supremacy. The courts, at least in theory, act as the referees that force ordinary legislation to submit to the fundamental text.
So the framework is given the power to restrain government action because it is structurally superior. It's the creator, not the created.
Precisely. This structural supremacy is what ensures the rule of law actually has teeth.
But if it's the creator, then who created the creator? I mean, this framework has to be fundamentally tied to the people themselves. The essay insists a genuine constitution is the act of the people.
It does.
So how do we reconcile that idea of a fundamental, almost unchangeable law with the dynamic will of the populace?
This is the philosophical source of its enduring legitimacy. It connects directly to the idea of popular sovereignty and, well, citizenship itself. A genuine constitution is understood as the avowed act of the people.
An avowed act.
Yes, explicitly expressing their consent to the structure and the ultimate ends of the regime. It is not a document imposed by a king or a conqueror or some sovereign faction. It is a consensual agreement among the governed on the rules for their own governance.
That idea of consent it's just revolutionary when you look at the long view of political history. It shifts authority away from inheritance or divine right and grounds it squarely in the collective will. But practically speaking, how is consent measured in a modern massive state? Most citizens were born long after the document was ratified. They never actually signed anything.
Right.
Doesn't the idea of perpetual consent just dilute the concept into mere inertia? People just go along with it because it's there.
That is a critical piece of friction that has to be addressed. And Adler's framework understands consent not just as a singular historical act of ratification.
Not just a moment in time.
No, but as a continuous institutionalized reality. The consent is ongoing. It's expressed through the very institutions the Constitution creates.
Like what? How is it expressed?
Through elections, for one, where citizens consent to be represented by the government operating under that framework. Through the courts, where citizens appeal to its protections, and crucially through the formal procedures for amendment, which allow citizens to withdraw or modify their consent over time.
So when citizens participate in the constitutional order, by voting, by paying taxes, by appealing to their rights, they are tacitly lending their continuous legitimacy to the entire framework.
Yes. They're reaffirming their consent. The power derived from the people inherently demands this kind of circular accountability.
And if that institutional expression of consent breaks down, say if elections are widely distrusted or if the government just ignores judicial interpretations,
then the legitimacy of the entire framework comes into question, regardless of how stable the document might look on paper.
the power has to flow back and forth.
It has to. Consent is the bedrock, but accountability is the mechanism that keeps that bedrock from cracking.
That discussion of legitimacy naturally makes me wonder, where did this idea of a foundational rule even begin? Let's transition to history, because it's so easy to think of constitutionalism as a purely modern thing, right? Inextricably linked to a written text.
Most people do.
But the essay is clear. The idea of a fundamental arrangement is ancient.
It is indeed. This concept did not just spring up fully formed in the revolutionary era of the 18th century. It has deep, deep roots extending all the way back into Greek political thought.
So we're talking about precursors.
Precursors, yes. Figures like Solon in Athens and Lycurgus in Sparta, they designed these incredibly complex political arrangements, their politia or regime, that were focused on balancing power, managing factional conflict, and ensuring societal stability.
So these were systems, not documents.
Exactly. Systems of accepted practice, institutional habits, and fundamental organizational principles, rather than a single codified text.
And Aristotle, working centuries later, he provided perhaps the most influential early classification of what constituted a true constitutional government.
Right.
I assume that must have informed Adler's thinking.
Oh, absolutely. Aristotle defined constitutional government fundamentally by the reciprocal nature of power and duty.
Reciprocal.
It was a regime in which citizens rule and are ruled in turn. This is a crucial concept.
It is, because it implies a temporary, rotating exercise of authority.
It does.
That reciprocal dynamic completely changes the character of the citizen, doesn't it? They aren't just passive recipients of rights.
No, they are active, temporary participants in governance.
That's a huge responsibility.
It is. It means a constitutional order requires citizens to take turns exercising authority. That's the ruling part. But it also necessitates that they submit to the authority of others when their turn is over. That's the being ruled part.
Which implies a high degree of civic maturity. A profound commitment to the process over your own personal temporary gain.
It does. The structure itself demands rotation and shared responsibility. It links the constitutional arrangement directly to the virtue of the citizenry, and it serves as a mechanism for preventing any single faction or individual from permanently monopolizing power.
So the genius of the ancients was in structuring society to demand virtue. But the modern era, post-Enlightenment, shifted dramatically. The move was from accepted practice and tradition to a supreme authoritative text. Why did that crystallization into a single written document happen?
Well, the shift to the supreme authoritative text was really driven by historical necessity. Primarily, the need for stability, clarity, and critically explicit limits following periods of instability, revolution, and civil conflict.
Because tradition and common law can be ambiguous.
Very ambiguous, and they're subject to manipulation by powerful elites.
That sounds like a recipe for constant conflict.
Yeah.
Just arguing over what the fundamental rules actually are.
It was, and therefore the emergence of written constitutions, which the essay explicitly cites as crystallizing with examples like the Massachusetts Constitution of 1780 and then, of course, the U.S. Constitution, offered a solution.
And what was the great power of these documents?
The immense power was that they were single authoritative texts that explicitly claimed, in writing, to be the supreme law of the land. This permanently subordinated the legislative and executive branches to a higher fixed textual authority.
The written word provided fixed rule.
And transparency and a mechanism for public recourse. It removed the ambiguity.
So the modern version is a clear fixed declaration that says, in essence, this is the foundational law that creates all other laws.
That's it.
And this crystallization didn't just provide a document, it formalized a set of essential requirements for a regime to be truly constitutional.
That's right. The historical evolution of political thought has really tied constitutionalism to four interlocking elements that are now, I think, universally viewed as fundamental prerequisites for any true constitutional order, especially in the context of a liberty and rights.
Let's dedicate some serious time to exploring these four pillars, because they seem to form the operational definition of modern restraint. Start with the rule of law.
Okay. The first pillar is the rule of law. This concept is deceptively simple.
It sounds simple.
It does, but it's profound. It means the government itself, its officials, and its agents are all subject to and accountable under the law. No one is above the law.
So in a pre-constitutional state, the king might make the law, but he stands above it.
Exactly. The constitutional order completely reverses this. The Constitution is the primary mechanism enforcing that submission. It dictates that the president, the prime minister, every single bureaucrat must obey the foundational law just like any private citizen.
That is the essential structural counter to tyranny, making sure the powerful cannot operate above the very rules they create and enforce.
It is.
But this creates an immediate practical tension, doesn't it? I mean, if the government is so tightly bound by these rigid rules, doesn't it become inefficient or incapable of acting quickly in an emergency?
That is the inherent trade-off. It's the central bargain. Constitutionalism is an expensive political choice.
What do you mean by expensive?
It sacrifices efficiency and speed of response for the sake of liberty and stability. The system is designed to be slow, to be cumbersome, to be hard to change.
And that's on purpose.
Precisely because quick, unconstrained government action is the gateway to arbitrary rule. The rule of law ensures that every action, even in a crisis, must be procedurally legitimate, and that, by definition, slows the apparatus down.
Okay, moving to the second pillar, protection of rights. This is where the constitutional framework defines what the government cannot do, regardless of what the majority wants.
Exactly. Protection of rights means the Constitution explicitly enumerates spheres of liberty, often articulated in a Bill of Rights, that the government cannot legitimately violate.
So we're talking about things like freedom of speech or religion?
Generally, yes. These are often considered negative rights, which means they are barriers against state intrusion. They place absolute hard boundaries on delegated power, regardless of majority will or some temporary political fervor.
But rights also create tension. We often hear debates over whether a constitution should also include positive rights entitlements, like the right to health care or housing. How does Adler's right-centered framework grapple with that?
Well, Adler's framework, focusing on these universal claims, often emphasizes those inalienable human rights necessary for human flourishing, which typically lean toward the negative rights. The government must leave you alone in these areas.
But the debate continues.
Oh, absolutely. The inclusion of positive rights in constitutional design is a central modern debate. Including them fundamentally shifts the definition of the state's responsibility from one of restraint to one of provision.
And that's a massive shift.
It is. While many just societies endorse these kinds of provisions, constitutional frameworks traditionally focus on establishing the barriers to prevent domination first. They ensure a baseline of liberty before requiring complex state services.
And the third essential pillar addresses the organization of power to prevent that very concentration we spoke of earlier, separation of powers.
Yes, this mandates that the core functions of government-making laws, which is legislative, executing laws, which is executive, and interpreting laws, which is judicial, must be held by distinct independent branches.
And the goal is to fragment power.
Structural fragmentation. It prevents power from centralizing into a single point, which historically is the primary gateway to abuse. The legislative branch must rely on the executive to enforce its laws, and both have to rely on the judicial branch to interpret the legality of their actions.
But in the real world, especially with the rise of the massive modern administrative state, power rarely stays neatly separated, does it?
It doesn't.
We see executive agencies making rules, which is a legislative function, and enforcing them, an executive function, and sometimes even adjudicating them, which is a judicial function. Doesn't this make the separation of powers an increasingly theoretical concept?
It creates immense practical difficulty. It's a huge challenge. Constitutional design has to constantly adapt to the historical reality of governmental growth.
So the framework is under strain.
Constantly. The rise of the administrative state, where power is necessarily centralized for efficiency in complex fields like environmental regulation or finance, it forces us to question whether the constitutional framework designed for an agrarian republic is still adequate.
So there's a tension.
A huge tension between the philosophical ideal of fragmentation and the functional necessity of unified, efficient administration. A true constitutional deep dive has to acknowledge this inherent strain.
Which brings us to the fourth element, the practical enforcement mechanism for all of this. Checks on arbitrary government.
Right. If separation of powers is the blueprint, then checks and balances are the operational mechanics.
These are the tools.
These are the tools. Vetoes, impeachment processes, judicial review, the power of the purse. These are the things that allow each branch to resist encroachment by the others.
So they enforce the accountability.
They are designed to enforce the accountability and prevent the arbitrary use of authority that we defined earlier. Without robust checks, the separation is just ink on paper.
And they have to be used.
They have to be used. If, for instance, the legislative branch loses its will to use the power of the purse to constrain the executive, the entire constitutional balance falters.
That is a powerful synthesis.
Yeah.
It confirms that the Constitution is so much more than just a procedural document. It's an elaborate, friction-filled mechanism for channeling power based on these abstract values.
Indeed. And now we have to discuss Adler's broader philosophical map. A constitution is not merely a set of rules for government. It is the practical manifestation of how a society chooses to manage its most difficult philosophical questions about human association.
What are the specific concepts Adler argues are fundamentally intertwined with and defined by the constitutional framework?
Adler identifies 6 crucial intersection points: government, law, liberty, equality, justice, and citizenship.
So these 6 concepts are all mutually dependent.
They are. And the way a constitution is drafted and implemented dictates how each of these concepts is defined and expressed in political reality. The Constitution acts as the matrix where all these major ideas meet and are translated from abstract ideals into enforceable political institutions.
And the consequence of these intersections is massive. I mean, they determine the moral direction of the state, defining the ultimate goal of political power.
Exactly. The essay insists that these 6 ideas, taken together, determine whether the political power that's been established actually serves the common good.
Meaning the well-being and flourishing of all citizens.
Right, or whether it simply entrenches domination. The systematic, legally enforced advantage of one group over another. This is the core moral litmus test. A constitution that fails to properly balance liberty, equality, and justice inevitably tips towards stabilizing a system of domination.
How, then, do these abstract values become tangible? If the abstract value is, say, equality, how does constitutional design ensure that value is implemented, not just spoken of?
Constitutional design is fundamentally a process of translation. The abstract values must be rendered into practical, functioning institutions that all citizens can see and interact with.
Okay, give me an example.
Take the abstract value of consent of the governed. This becomes tangible through formalized institutions like periodic, free, and fair elections. That's the institution that ensures representation and continuous accountability.
What about justice? That feels like the most difficult and universal value to try and codify.
Justice is translated into the institutional sphere through courts, through due process clauses, the right to legal counsel, and all the institutional mechanisms that ensure the fair application of law, regardless of a person's political or economic status.
So justice is a high ideal, but constitutional due process is the institutional reality of that ideal.
That's a perfect way to put it. Similarly, liberty is translated into the institution of bills of rights, creating explicit legal barriers against state overreach. Even the formalized, often difficult procedures for amendment are institutions. They're designed to allow the framework to evolve to better meet the demands of justice over time without requiring a violent revolution.
It sounds less like the design is about creating new power and much more about channeling existing power into responsible directions. It's about ensuring accountability at every single turn.
That is a precise summary. It's an elaborate mechanism for responsibility and restraint, and it translates these high ideals into practical, often bureaucratic procedures. This is the ultimate aim of constitutional engineering.
Before we delve into the deep, normative question of constitutional design, we want to invite you to check out Mindful Moments. It's our YouTube channel offering AI essay analysis, summaries, and critiques, all designed to inspire reflection and rational thought.
We take concepts just like these, distill them, and present them in a format that really encourages deep intellectual engagement.
Right. So focusing now on that normative question. This is the critical test, where we stop admiring the structure of the machine and start judging its ethical substance.
And the essay raises the fundamental question. Does a given constitution actually secure inalienable human rights and civic equality for all citizens, or is it merely a document of convenience?
The counter-argument to stability is so essential for critical thinking, particularly for anyone listening. We have to confront the possibility that a perfectly functioning framework might be fundamentally unjust.
The alternative is asking whether the Constitution merely stabilizes an unjust distribution of power. A constitution can be perfectly stable and effective at maintaining order. It could define all the offices and procedures perfectly, but if that order systematically denies rights or benefits to a specific group,
Or if it legally entrenches inequality.
then it fails the normative test. The document may be legally valid as the supreme law of the land, but that does not automatically make it philosophically or morally just. We must always question what power it institutionalizes and for whose benefit.
That encourages you, the listener, to view the Constitution not as some sacred relic to be blindly obeyed, but as a living, applied document that has to be continually tested against universal ethical claims.
Precisely. If we apply the Adlerian framework, we're encouraged to question whether the constitutional framework itself is the fundamental cause of social injustices, or if those injustices are merely the result of poorly written or poorly implemented laws passed under an otherwise adequate framework.
And that distinction, challenging the framework versus challenging a law, that pushes the analysis one level deeper, which is our mission here.
It's the whole point.
So let's formalize that distinction. The essay makes a clear, critical distinction between two levels of engagement with this topic: information versus understanding. Let's start with the facts. What does the essay consider information in this context?
Information, which is the lower bar, is the factual data you can memorize and recount. This includes the specific dates when particular constitutions were adopted, the precise structures like the number of representatives or terms of office,
Lists of offices, their delegated powers, the exact procedures for appointment or legislation.
Right. These are the facts of history and procedure.
That is the stuff of basic civics knowledge. It's necessary for political participation, because you have to know the rules of the game, but it is not sufficient for philosophical judgment or for any kind of meaningful critique.
Absolutely. You can be fully informed. You could cite Article 1, Section 8 by heart. You can name every single office and still completely lack genuine understanding of constitutionalism. Information tells you what the rules are. It doesn't tell you why those rules are necessary or whether they are just.
Okay, so what defines understanding, the true goal for the learner?
Understanding is the synthesis of those facts into ethical and practical necessity. It means grasping why the process is designed the way it is.
It's the why behind the what.
It is. Understanding involves comprehending why limiting power, separating governmental functions, and grounding authority in continuous consent are necessary conditions for achieving a political order that respects freedom, equality, and human flourishing. It's the comprehension of the universal purpose behind the specific, temporary procedure.
So it's the difference between knowing the constitutional requirement that mandates a census every 10 years versus understanding why the periodic counting of the population is constitutionally necessary for ensuring equal representation and for balancing political power across geographical lines.
That's a perfect example. Understanding allows for a critique of the structure itself.
It does. And that ability to critique the design based on its philosophical outcomes leads us directly to the ultimate standard, the philosophical test of adequacy.
This is the real heart of the essay's argument.
Let's get to the ultimate aha moment of the essay, drawn directly from Adler's right-centered perspective. A constitution can be stable, it can be effective, fully implemented, and yet still fail this test. So what makes a constitution philosophically adequate?
From this rigorous perspective, a constitution is philosophically adequate only insofar as it institutionalizes universal claims.
Universal claims, what does that mean?
These universal claims are explicitly defined as inalienable human rights and civic equality claims that apply to every human being simply by virtue of their humanity, regardless of their status, their wealth, or their political affiliation at the moment the document was written.
This means the Constitution must serve something transcendent. It has to aspire to the ideals of justice and liberty that exist outside of and are superior to the temporary political majority that wrote the document.
Exactly. The great ideas of justice and liberty are universal ideals, and the Constitution, to be adequate, must be their primary institutional vehicle. This is the mechanism by which the political order attempts to achieve moral rectitude.
Let's use a specific historical case study to illustrate the difference between mere effectiveness and philosophical inadequacy. We could look at the U.S. Constitution before the Civil War amendments. By every measure, it was effective. It organized power, it was limited by the Bill of Rights, and it was accountable to the existing citizenry.
It was a functioning system.
It was. Yet by Adler's standard, it failed the test of adequacy. Why?
It failed profoundly because it did not institutionalize universal claims for all. It explicitly allowed chattel slavery and denied civic equality and indeed basic human rights to millions of people based on race.
So it was a stable framework.
A stable framework that expertly organized power, but because that framework codified the victorious faction's will, the power of slaveholders, the exclusion of women, of non-property owners, it failed the philosophical test.
It served domination, not the common good.
It did. And that failure point forces us to confront the fact that stability is not equivalent to justice. A framework can be effective at maintaining political order while simultaneously being morally bankrupt because it merely encodes the systematic advantage of the group that won the foundational struggle.
So the constitutional framework is only as good as its dedication to serving these universal truths.
That's right. And the subsequent history of constitutional evolution in many nations, particularly the history of amendments following great moral struggles, is essentially the long, difficult process of attempting to close that gap.
To move the framework from encoding factional will toward institutionalizing those universal claims that were initially neglected or denied.
Precisely. That's the ongoing project.
This has been a tremendously dense and illuminating deep dive into the philosophical structure of constitutionalism. Let's review the key takeaways for you, the listener, starting with the definition.
We established that a constitution is the fundamental limiting framework. It defines power as organized, limited, and accountable. Its legitimacy is born of the explicit, continuous consent of the people, granting it status as the supreme foundational law that creates all other law.
And we traced its history from the ancient arrangements defined by Aristotle's concept of citizens who rule and are ruled in turn, all the way through to the modern written text that formalized the prerequisites of the rule of law, the protection of rights, the separation of powers, and robust checks on arbitrary authority.
And we acknowledged the inherent trade-offs in efficiency that this kind of system demands.
We did. And finally, we established that crucial distinction between mere information and true understanding. We emphasized that a constitution is tested not just by its procedural effectiveness or its stability,
but by its philosophical adequacy, its success in institutionalizing universal claims like liberty and equality, rather than serving as the legal structure for domination. True understanding lies in grasping the necessity and the fragility of these constraints for human flourishing.
So, if a constitution is defined by institutionalizing universal claims, we leave you with this final provocative thought. What current political or social conflict can only be resolved by challenging the constitutional framework itself, rather than simply the laws passed under it?
That is the question we leave you with.
Demanding you use this framework to analyze the world around you, not just accept it.
This profound knowledge is meant to be actively applied.
Click the link on screen for more on this and other essay subjects. Subscribe, share, purchase via link, and think rationally.
See the many genre-based essay podcasts at Mindful Moments. Nourish your mind on the go.